And, the question is that ethical? Is it ethical for them to experiment on themselves or to give other people that information? Right. Another good example is prosthetics. There are people who use 3D printers and open source code to create and print limbs for children and adults with limb deficiencies, with missing hands and missing feet or legs. And they're doing it quite effectively. And so I tell the story in the book of one nonprofit organization called Enable. And Enable basically is a group of volunteers that have come together. They use their own 3D printers, their own blueprints. They share information to create these prosthetics, especially for children who can't afford them. And so I was once at a hospital in the United States called Johns Hopkins University Hospital, where I debated an official from the Food and Drug Administration. And at that conference, a bunch of biohackers and 3D printer people came together and made on the spot in an auditorium in the hospital new hands for children however they wanted them. And children would come up and they'd say, "What kind of hand do you want?" them? They say, "I want a hand that makes me look like Iron Man or the Wolverine." And instantaneously on the spot, someone would fire up a 3D printer and use a blueprint that would give that child a new functional hand that was like yellow and red like Iron Man. And you can imagine how happy that made that child. And it made their parents even happier because guess what? A professional, regulatory approved prosthetic would cost them thousands and thousands of dollars they don't have. They were getting this prosthetic hands for free. They weren't being charged. It was a voluntary payment system that was set up by people to fund this. So I debated this FDA regulator, Food and Drug Administration regulator, which oversees medical devices in the United States. And I asked this doctor, I said, "Doctor, there are amazing things happening in this hospital today. I would call them technological miracles. But correct me if I'm wrong, isn't everything that is happening here with these 3D printers completely illegal under current law?" And he said, "Well, yes, it kind of is, but we're not going to sanction anyone or fine them yet or anything." I said, "What? Yet? What are you going to do? Are you going to come after these average parents, these average coders, these average 3D printers? And you're going to put them in jail for giving children new hands? Really?" And what the Food and Drug Administration later did is they decided to change policy towards prosthetics. And in a very creative move, they issued guidance for 3D printed prosthetic technologies that said, instead of regulating them, we're going to offer innovators advice for how to do it safely. That's a good model. I mean, what happened there, though, is important, is that technological change, evasive entrepreneurialism, and new technologies of freedom, they changed that political dynamic. They made the Food and Drug Administration regulators realize we can no longer regulate the way we used to regulate. We can't use top-down command and control regulations anymore. We have to be more flexible. And so issuing, as they did, a set of guidance principles saying, if you use a 3D printer to do this, be careful about this and that. And it also made some good points. Like, for example, a 3D printed prosthetic hand is easier to make and less dangerous than a 3D prosthetic printed foot. Because if you mess up a foot, if it doesn't work, you could have trips and falls and more serious accidents. So there was a different set of standards or best practices that they recommended for like 3D printed feet and legs. And that makes sense because I'm all right with government doing that so long as it's not saying, and therefore you can never do it again without our permission. It was saying, go ahead and keep doing this, but here are some guidelines. Here are some principles to guide innovation. That's a really good example of going back to what I started with, of experimental administration or experimental government, right? It's government saying like, look, we don't have to be command and control, and so rigid about regulation. They still exist. The regulator is not going away, but at least they're doing things better, and they're doing it better because of technological change, evasive entrepreneurialism, and the rise of technologies of freedom. That's what changed that dynamic. And so going back to the ethical question, again, is it ethical for those people to do what they did with the 3D printers to create the hands and the feet for the kids? I would say absolutely it is. That made the world better.